The Railway series celebrates its 80th anniversary in 2025. Its author, the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, wrote the first stories for his sixth son, Christopher, but they developed into something more. Wilbert had an interest in railways from a young age, and as an adult would become intertwined with the growing railway preservation movement, not just promoting them through his books, but volunteering to keep them running, even becoming president of multiple railway societies, and providing lectures and articles on real history. He is remembered for his stories, but I think he deserves to be remembered for much more. Wilbert Awdry was born on the 15th of June 1911 at Ampfield Vicarage, the son of Vere and Lucy Awdry. His father, the vicar of St Mark's Church, had endured the death of 2 wives and 2 children before Wilbert's birth. His only half-sibling was Carol Awdry, born in 1894, 15 years Wilbert's senior. But the brothers were still close, helped, in no small part, to a railway. When Carol was young, he and Vere had built the Ampfield Model Railway, a garden railway running around the vicarage with a steam-powered engine. Wilbert would be allowed to push coaches along the line, and among his first words were Puff Puff. Carol would often play with Wilbert, and bought him his favourite toy, a monkey named Jacko, but their relationship would not last long. By 1913 he had enrolled at the Sandhurst Military Academy, and a year later would be one of the first sent to the front lines of World War I. Only 13 days after deployment, Carol was killed in action. Vere's grief for his lost son was great, but it strengthened his bond with Wilbert. The pair would often walk up to the railway together, climbing the embankment to stand at the line side to watch special trains, or visit the workman's hut, who would tell them stories about the railway. On the 10th of August, 1916, a new member of the family was born. George Awdry, Wilbert's brother. Vere would retire the year after, with the family moving to a house named the Wilderness in Box. From the bedroom window, Wilbert and his father were able to look out onto the Great Western Main Line, and would use a telescope to record engines together. Staying in Box, they moved again to Townsend in 1919, and a few months later Lawn Villa, which was renamed Journey's End. The house was only 200 yards from Box Tunnel, and the 1 in 100 incline adjoining it. At night, the sound of goods trains could be heard, whistling for a banker and struggling up the hill, almost like a conversation between 2 engines. Wilbert would not stay in the house long, as he soon started boarding at Marlborough House School. Visits to and with family were often, with many involving railways. A visit to the British Empire exhibition in 1924 saw Wilbert conveniently get lost in the Palace of Engineering, where he could admire locomotives, Flying Scotsman and Carefully Castle. When at home, he and his brother would build a model layout in their shed for a double O-gauge clockwork engine. In 1925 he moved on to high school at Dauncey in Wiltshire, where he took his confirmation to the church, with classes led by the local vicar, Percival Sexty. The Reverend Awdry, although he had retired from running his own parish, would still officiate when other priests took time off, but by 1928 he was in a serious state of health. By this time, George had started at Dauncey School, and on July 12th his parents received a brief postcard about how he was going into town to collect his stolen bike. Only an hour after chuckling at the card Lucy had shown him, Awdry passed away. Lucy sold Journey's End and moved to Wiltshire to be with her sons, who started a new model railway in an old stable, their first foray into electric. The layout would be named Farquhar, for Faraway Quarry, but neither could know that this would eventually be the start of a much larger world they would create together. Once high school was complete, Wilbert moved to Oxford to attend St Peter's Hall, where he began to consider his attitude towards the Christian faith. Although his father was a vicar, he had never forced religion onto his son. Still, Wilbert decided to follow in Vere's footsteps. By 1933 he had earned his diploma in theology at Oxford's Wycliffe Hall and, on his tutor's advice to gain secular experience, accepted his offer of a teaching post at St George's School in Jerusalem, starting on the 26th of September. Not everything was work-related. He visited local holy sites and went as far as Cairo in 1934. 1935 would see him attend a Christmas party, where he would meet Margaret Emily Whale, who, like Wilbert, had moved from England to teach. Although Wilbert was uncomfortable around women, he and Margaret became friends, and when Wilbert arranged a group trip to Petra, she was invited along. On the final night of their stay, the pair found privacy and, in the half-light of the early evening, Wilbert proposed. The engaged couple would return to England in 1936, when Margaret would first meet Lucy Awdry. His mother was disapproving at first, but the pair were soon friends. They also visited George, who had followed his brother to St. Peter's Hall and was studying to become a librarian. Margaret went back to Jerusalem for another 2 years of teaching, while Awdry returned to Wycliffe Hall to take his deacon's exam. He was ordained as a Church of England deacon at Winchester Cathedral on the 20th of December, and moved to Odium in Hampshire to begin life as a holy man. Wilbert began as a deacon at All Saints' Church, serving under Reverend Lancelot Cole. He returned to Winchester Cathedral on December 19th, where he was ordained as a priest. Margaret returned to England in 1939, and the couple were married on the 30th of August at St George's Church, Worcester. Not long after, Awdry received an invitation from Reverend Percival Sexty, who had led classes for his confirmation, to work under him as the curate of Great Cheverel. Wilbert had never felt entirely accepted at All Saints, so gladly accepted. They initially got on well, with Sexty giving him more responsibility than Reverend Cole did, but their relationship would sour with the outbreak of the Second World War. Sexty wanted Awdry to volunteer as an army chaplain, but Wilbert was a pacifist and refused to take such a role. In 1940, Sexty gave him notice. He would be gone by September 14th. To add to the predicament, July 2nd saw the birth of Wilbert and Margaret's first child, Christopher Vere Awdry. He had trouble finding a new position and considered finding a secular job before being contacted by the Bishop of Birmingham, Ernest Barnes. Another pacifist, he invited Awdry to curacy at St Nicholas Church in Kings Norton, working under Canon Thomas Dunn, who he took an instant liking to. During the family's second year in Birmingham, Christopher fell ill with measles and was contained to his room. To cheer the toddler up, Wilbert would tell him stories and rhymes, with one about trains lined up in a shed becoming a particular favourite of Christopher's. Wilbert drew a picture to go alongside the rhyme, depicting a set of engines, each with a different expression, one of them frowning. Christopher questioned who he was and why he was sad. Wilbert named the engine Edward, saying he was old, and let him out of the shed with help from a kindly crew, the start of the Railway series. Christopher enjoyed the story, so his father would soon come up with another. Looking back to his own childhood, listening to the goods trains at Box, Wilbert told him the story of Edward helping a bossy engine up a hill. The new engine would be named Gordon, after an equally bossy child who lived on their street. Another rhyme would inspire the third story, with Wilbert elaborating on the text to explain that the engine, named Henry, didn't want to get his paint wet, and was shut up because of it. Even after his measles were gone, Christopher enjoyed hearing the three stories, but insisted on them being told the same every time, leading Wilbert to write them down and draw pictures to accompany them. Later in the year, Wilbert built a toy train for Christopher, as the war made such goods expensive. A lack of parts led to the engine being a new character, a tank engine with 6 small wheels, a boiler made of a broomstick handle, the number 1, and lettering NW for Nowhere Railway. The engine looked similar to an LNER J50 and was accompanied by a truck and a coach. Christopher would name the engine Thomas and ask for stories about him, though these would develop slower than those about Edward, Gordon and Henry. Margaret was impressed with Wilbert's stories and encouraged him to get them published, writing to Lucy Awdry about them. Through Lucy's connections, the stories started being offered to publishers, but wartime paper shortages meant no one wanted to take the risk on a new author. That was until they were shown to Edmund Ward, a Leicester-based printing company, 6 months after leaving the Awdrys. Franklin Edmund Ward had begun searching for children's stories to publish in 1941, to fill the lack of children's books the war had caused, and had published 13 before receiving the Awdry stories in 1943. They bought them for £25, gave them names, Edward's Day Out, Edward and Gordon and the Sad Story of Henry, and decided to publish them in a single book, The 3 Railway Engines. However, they saw the need for a 4th story to round out the set, featuring all 3. Awdry had never considered Henry's story connected to Edward's, but gave it a go, ultimately deciding to liberate Henry from the tunnel. This new story, as well as requested pictures for an illustrator's reference, was sent off in November, with Wilbert being paid an extra £12 and 12 shillings. 2 weeks after receiving payment, Wilbert's second child was born, Veronica Awdry, on the 18th of December. The money was much appreciated, but Edmund Ward's lack of commitment to a publishing date was not. 1944 went by with no news of the 3 railway engines. It was not until February of 1945 that the book would begin being printed. Ward had chosen William Middleton to turn Awdry's pictures into illustrations, but Middleton's inexperience, as well as his lack of confidence in stories about dirty old locomotives, led to disappointing pictures. Henry, in particular, proved the problem. Awdry had drawn him as a 442 to distinguish him from the other engines, but Middleton drew him as a 462, the same as Gordon. Wilbert was not pleased with the illustrations, but was satisfied with the book overall. The 3 railway engines released on the 12th of May, only 4 days after VE Day celebrated the end of the war. It proved a success, encouraging Wilbert to send off a now completed set of stories about Christopher's other engine, Thomas the Tank Engine. £45 were paid for the manuscript, and Alexander Reginald Payne hired as illustrator, someone who could more accurately capture the engines. However, he requested that, like Middleton, he be provided with reference pictures made by Wilbert. Although not happy with the arrangement, Awdry followed through as best he could, reusing angles where possible to save time and effort. Another annoyance came in April of 1946, when the publishers asked Awdry to shave the story down by 2 pages. As the stories were so short, and Wilbert economic with words when writing, he struggled to complete this task. It certainly wasn't helped by it coinciding with the birth of his 3rd child, Hilary Awdry, who arrived on the 12th, and the family moving to a new home soon after. Wilbert had been given his own parish in Ellsworth, Cambridgeshire, leaving Birmingham after 6 years. When the family arrived, they found the church and rectory in a poor state, with the house being infected. Margaret took the newborn to stay with her mother, Christopher and Veronica stayed with Lucy, and Wilbert lived in village lodgings while the house was made habitable, with the family finally able to move in 3 months after intended. In better news, on the 14th of September 1946, Awdry's second book, Thomas the Tank Engine, was published. Awdry was mostly satisfied with Payne's work, calling it immeasurably superior to Middleton's. However, there was one major difference from Awdry's vision. Like Henry, Thomas had undergone a metamorphosis from his original design. Payne lived in the south, so used a southern tank engine as a basis, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway's E2. Wilbert's initial annoyance was quelled upon being told about the authentic inspiration. And that was almost the end. Wilbert had used up the stories he told Christopher. Edmund Ward was content to keep reprinting the 2 books they had. But one man pushed for the duology to become something more. Eric Marriott. Marriott, who had joined the company in early 1947, knew that eventually the reprints would have to compete with new releases, and persuaded Ward to invite Awdry to write another. The author was honoured, and decided to write about a character who had only been seen briefly, James. Payne was unable to return due to mental health problems, so the publishers selected Clarence Reginald Dalby as the new illustrator. His partnership with Awdry would be uneasy. Wilbert saw his pictures as inaccurate and inconsistent, but the dynamic and colourful art allowed him to be kept on for future titles, and the following year he would redo pictures from the first book. Yet if Wilbert had a problem with the 3rd book, it was not with the pictures. James the Red Engine, published in September of 1948, would be his least favourite of the series. He explored railway books and magazines for inspiration, but he was not writing for his son or for himself, but for a deadline, and believed the text suffered for it. It did inspire him to begin work on a new model layout, Tidmouth to Knapford, marking the start of Awdry world-building his fictional railway. But the next book, focusing on Thomas's branch line, would be what really got the ball rolling. Wilbert would test story drafts on his children, and during a read-through of Thomas and Bertie, the 3 said that Thomas only won because he had an advantage. Wilbert drew a map of Thomas's line, to demonstrate that engine and bus each faced the same number of obstacles. This became the Farquhar branch line, the name taken from his and George's 1928 layout. Tank Engine Thomas Again released on the 31st of December 1949, starting a trend of one book releasing a year. The success of the books led to Edmund Ward giving Awdry a gratitude payment of £200. While considering the next book, Wilbert continued work on his layout. By July, track laying and wiring was complete, but no details added, despite it being promised for the church's summer fete. He and George spent the preceding week making the railway presentable, with it proving popular when revealed. The star was Wilbert's model of Thomas, a repaint of an off-the-shelf 060. Afterwards, the layout could be visited by appointment. One of these visitors was an undergraduate from Cambridge, Teddy Boston, who had become a frequent visitor and friend to Wilbert, and on his first visit was able to see the newest engine, Percy. Percy's model was scratch-built by Awdry, and photos would be sent for Dalby to use as reference in the fifth book, Troublesome Engines, published in September. The development of this book would see one of the few meetings between author and illustrator, with Dalby visiting Ellsworth to meet Awdry, leading to the family being included in an illustration in the book. By 1950, Wilbert was wondering where his railway was to be set. That question was answered when preaching at Douglas on the Isle of Man, when he discovered their bishop's full title, the Bishop of Sodor and Man. This was due to the diocese originally containing the Sudreys, islands to the west of Scotland, but that had not been the case in over 7 centuries. So, Wilbert claimed Sodor for himself. He and George began research to detail the map, expanding the island's culture over the years, with many ties to the region's authentic history. For example, the Isle of Man's Godric Craven added the island to his territory in the 11th century. The beginning of a language, Sudric, even formed, adding etymology to the location names on the island. The initials NWR, initially for Nowhere Railway, found their place as the North Western Railway. The brothers became infatuated with Sodor, adding to it over the decades, and Wilbert believes he may not have written more books if not for their world building. 1951 saw Awdry propose the creation of a relief map of the island, to be used to promote the series. Edmund Ward agreed, commissioning model maker P.R. Wickham to create the map, who questioned Awdry about landscape details he hadn't yet considered. But while Sodor was being added to, something, or someone, was in danger of being taken away. Henry had some inconsistency in every book. Tank Engine Thomas Again was the worst, where he was drawn to look too much like Gordon, but even being given back his green paint in Troublesome Engines didn't solve things. Awdry was tempted to write him out, but instead decided to change him into something he could work with. The inspiration for the crash of the Flying Kipper came from a story told by Teddy Boston about an accident near Lincoln, where he was studying theology. Henry was sent to crew, the first mention of a real location in the series, and returned as a Black 5 locomotive, giving illustrators a direct reference for consistency. Henry's book, released in July, also saw the engines given numbers like Thomas had. Around that time, Awdry was sent a newspaper article about an unusual railway in Wales, the narrow gauge Talyllyn, which was now being run by volunteers. Awdry had never liked the government-run British Railways, and applied for membership, being the 79th to respond to the appeal. He wanted to volunteer over the summer, but Margaret had already booked a holiday in Norfolk, where he would discover an entirely different engine. A visit to Yarmouth was Awdry's first meeting with a J70 tram engine. After the holiday, he would be invited for a footplate ride on such a tram by Teddy Boston, who'd become curate at Wisbeach, part of the Wisbeach and Upwell Tramway. The trams would become the inspiration for Toby, whose book was published in July 1952. That summer, the family went to Talyllyn so Wilbert could work on the Talyllyn Railway. On their first evening, he and Christopher were allowed to walk down the line to the workshops, where an inquiry under a sheet gave them a look at Talyllyn herself, the line's original engine that was going unused in favour of Edward Thomas and Sir Hayden. Awdry's volunteering saw him work as a guard. Once, when running an evening train, he was eager to leave to let another train pass, leaving the station's refreshment lady behind, a story he would pass on to Peter Sam. But, although he was eager to write about the narrow gauge line, it would not make an appearance for another 2 years. 1953 started with a big change for the family. Wilbert and Margaret had never been fond of Ellsworth, so in January they moved to Emneth, with Wilbert starting at St Edmund's Church. The vicar had been looking to retire, and it was close to Wisbeach High School, which Veronica and Hilary would attend. Proximity to the Wisbeach and Upwell Tramway was a happy benefit for Wilbert, and he got on well with people in the community. Unlike the prior move, the rectory required no upkeep. The house was large, with 3 attics. One became a playroom for the girls, while Wilbert claimed the others to rebuild his Tidmouth to Knapford layout. The year saw another 00 gauge adaptation of Sodor, this time by the BBC, for the series' first TV adaptation. 2 stories were planned, with models built by P.R. Wickham. The first was The Sad Story of Henry, broadcast live on June 14th. It didn't go well. The spotlight of the show was when Henry derailed, requiring a hand to intervene and set things straight. Awdry added the complaint of James gatecrashing the story, and many newspapers reported on the poor showing. Needless to say, the second episode never aired. Gordon's book released a few days after, and in 1954 Edward got his own title. The family holiday that year was again to the Talyllyn. Between this visit and 2 years of world building with George, Wilbert was finally ready to write about his narrow gauge railway, the Skarloey, with 4 little engines releasing in 1955. Around this time, Wilbert began work on another layout and perhaps his most iconic, the Farquhar branch line. It was built for the 1956 Wisbech Trades Fair and made to be easily transported. It proved popular, with Toby being a particular favourite. It was only a year since the last J70 had run on the local tramway. In addition to Thomas, Percy and Toby, Wilbert had a spare engine, a 5700 pannier tank engine. Due to a defect, it had a waddle when moving, leading to it being named Duck, a character introduced in Percy the Small Engine. While it was being written, author and illustrator met for the second time, exhibiting the books together in London. Awdry had often sent Dalby reference material through photos of engines and his models, but was still upset with the final result. Tension peaked over Percy. Wilbert said he looked like a green caterpillar with red stripes, as well as Dalby depicting Duck as a 6400 class, instead of a 5700. Dalby had respect for Awdry, but had never been confident in his book's longevity, dismissed concerns of inconsistencies, and even tried to start his own series, Flitterwick Harbour. Despite this, he was still sorry to leave the series and the engines, and cited stricter deadlines being his reason for leaving, rather than Wilbert's complaints. John Theodore Kenny was chosen to take over, and was very different from Dalby, preferring to draw engines from life. Frequent visits to Wilbert made the two close friends, and his first book, The 8 Famous Engines, released in 1957. This book was almost the last, with Wilbert writing it as if it were a finale to the series. He went on to write an original book on commission for another publisher, Brockham Press, after he was inspired by 3-wheeled cars his children thought looked like beetles. Belinda the Beetle was released in 1958, but Awdry was upset at not being shown the rough illustrations. When a sequel was written in 1961, titled Belinda Beats the Band, he wrote with the condition that Kenny would illustrate. Years after, when Veronica brought home her first boyfriend after time away, Wilbert ignored both to first marvel at his car, a Belinda. Despite the detour, Wilbert found he still had ideas for his railway, and the series returned for its annual release, with its first venture into the modern world. With the increasing prominence of diesels on railways, Marriott had continuously tried to get Awdry to include one in his books. Wilbert had always been traditional, so the first, introduced in Duck and the Diesel Engine, was a villain. This, along with the first appearance of a real engine, City of Truro, are indicative of Awdry tying the series increasingly closer to real life, and writing with the changing railway landscape in mind. 1959's The Little Old Engine, for example, would directly mention the Talyllyn, encouraging readers to visit in a much more explicit manner than the acknowledgement in 4 Little Engines. By this time, Wilbert had volunteered 5 times on the line, and the last story, Little Old Twins, would be based on the BBC recording the Welsh Railway for TV, where he made an appearance as a guard. In November, the Church of England newspaper approached the Reverend about writing stories for their children's section. Taking inspiration from his layout, Awdry wrote about the little people who lived on it dealing with the realities of a model world, such as trains never running to time or the lack of important details like brakes. After the series ended, he was invited back to write further stories. Starting in late 1960, these would be focused on real railways and engines, starting with the 1804 Penydarren engine, the first steam engine in the world. and he would continue these articles for another 7 years. By now, he was also doing talks about railway history at events. One of these took him to the Bluebell Railway, the first standard gauge preservation railway, where he would see Stepney, their first engine, and later, main character of his book. The danger preservation railways were saving steam engines from was first shown in the twin engines, where Douglas was at risk of scrap, reflecting the rapid shift to diesel power by British Railways. But while dieselisation was unpopular, Awdry began warming up to them, and 1962's branch line engines would introduce Sodor's first permanent diesel, Daisy. It would also mark the series surpassing 2 million sales, so a celebration was held at the Bluebell on the 29th of September. Gallant old engine followed in 1963, when another small railway would open closer to home. Teddy Boston had bought an engine named Pixie, and built a light railway around his rectory grounds. Another of his vehicles, Thistledown, would be used by Kenny as reference for George the Steamroller. But when Wilbert came to write about Stepney, promoting the Bluebell Railway and preservation movement to readers, Kenny was beginning to face issues with his eyesight. Gunver Edwards was invited to take over, and immediately got to work on the drawing of Diesel by the shed. However, the size restriction of the image gave her difficulty, and Peter Edwards, her husband, offered to take over. Despite his art being more impressionistic, Awdry enjoyed Peter's work. He visited the Bluebell to draw their engines from life, and although most work was done by him, and all work in future books, the couple would always be credited together. Wilbert and Teddy would visit another unusual railway that year, the Snowdon Mountain Railway, which became the inspiration for the next book, with Peter following to illustrate the line. By the publishing of Very Old Engines in 1965, Awdry had decided to retire from Emneth. It was a hard decision, as he was deeply involved in the community, popular even among those who didn't go to church. But with a renegotiation of the books giving him an income of over £1,000 a year, and many letters to respond to from children or parents looking for advice, it was time to move on. He and Margaret moved to 30 Rodborough Avenue in Stroud, with Wilbert exchanging their number for an LMS shed plate. Although no longer in charge of his own parish, Wilbert would still practice often, standing in for priests who fell ill or went on holiday, in addition to his railway talks and volunteering. In 1966, Wilbert began rebuilding the Farquhar layout. He had sold the van he had used to transport it, so needed to make it smaller to fit in his car. But he was also focusing on a smaller layout, the Mid-Sodor, a 009 layout, that would become a central part of the island's world building, and the focus of Wilbert's penultimate book. Percy would be released this year as a wind-up engine by Meccano, the first commercial model of one of Awdry's characters, complete with a loop of track and 2 trucks. Wilbert kept up to date on steam engines around the country, and visited the Port of Par to see its unusual pair of engines, Alfred and Judy, who he was writing into his next book, Mainline Engines, as Bill and Ben. He and Teddy would also visit the Raven Glass and Eskdale Railway, where they experienced events that would become Tit for Tat and Mike's Whistle in 1967's Small Railway Engines, where the author and his friend made direct appearances as the thin and fat clergyman. Awdry was a member of many preservation movements around the country, like the Talyllyn Railway and the Ditko Railway Centre, but 1967 saw him appointed as president of a new organisation, the North Eastern Locomotive Preservation Group. Their first engine was J27 65894, raising £1,400 to save the engine, followed by Q6 63395 in 1968. 1968 also saw the A2 locomotive Blue Peter bought by private owners, who formed the Blue Peter Locomotive Society to take care of the engine. Wilbert was once again appointed president, but the engine had another big name behind it, the children's show Blue Peter. The engine was back in steam by 1970, with a major event for its return. Another famous LNER Pacific, Flying Scotsman, then the only steam engine allowed on Britain's main lines, would appear in 1967's Enterprising Engines. The book began wrapping up the stories of Sodor's characters, and would introduce Oliver, a Great Western 1400. His book would follow, with an acknowledgement of the Dart Valley Railway, where another of the class, Bulliver, resided. In 1970, Duke the Lost Engine was published. Wilbert and George had visited the Festiniog in 1958, and had been allowed a ride on the footplate of Prince, who would inspire Duke. But, by this book, Wilbert was running out of steam, and warned Marriott not to expect another story soon. 1971 marked the first gap in the railway series in 23 years. It did, however, see Wilbert visit the Nene Valley Railway in Peterborough to grant their engine, number 1800, the name Thomas, the first real engine to represent the character. Awdry was back in 1972, returning to Thomas's line to write tramway engines. He reused his insult to Dalby, a green caterpillar with red stripes, and introduced Mavis, who he had built for the Farquhar layout, and was based on the BR Class 04s who had taken over the Wisbech tramway. Awdry wanted his next book to be called Really Useful Engines, but he didn't have the ideas to fill it, and didn't want to force substandard stories. To add, his mother, Lucy, passed away this year at the age of 87. Marriott left room open for another book, but when it was clear the railway series was over, he left the company to move to Pelham Books. There was another proposal to continue the series, again as a TV show, this time from Broadway's Andrew Lloyd Webber. He had a large respect for Awdry and proposed a musical TV series, animated in the style of Ivor the Engine, but his offer was too much for Awdry and the publishers, essentially handing ownership of the series to him. It was argued necessary to secure investment in America, but the deal fell through. It did, however, lead to the production of the Starlight Express, a successful Broadway musical. The next 5 years continued with Wilbert visiting heritage railways, running his model layouts at exhibitions, lecturing on railway history and covering duties for other priests. In 1979, he returned to writing to collaborate with Dr. Christopher Cook on a guide to the steam railways of Britain, covering 128 preservation railways. He would also see the first meeting of Awdry with Britt Allcroft. She was making a film on the resurgence of steam in the UK and, while filming on the Bluebell Railway, interviewed Awdry. Having read his books in preparation, she discussed adapting them to TV afterwards, managing to secure the TV publishing rights, and began working to adapt the series. A celebration was held at the National Railway Museum in 1980 for the 35th anniversary of the series. 1982 would see the first visit of a Scarlowe engine to the Talyllyn, with Sir Haydon becoming Sir Handel. This would prove popular, and for the next engine in 1988, Wilbert would act as a representative of Sodor to hand Peter Sam over. In 1983, Awdry was elected as president of the Dean Forest Railway, which had been formed in 1970. By now, filming of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was underway. David Mitton was brought on as director and Beatles drummer Ringo Starr as narrator. Ringo would visit Awdry during production, with the two getting along well, and Ringo being impressed by his layout. But Britt would be beat to new Thomas content. Christopher Awdry had resumed the railway series. On a visit to the Nene Valley Railway in 1979, he had been inspired to write a set of stories. He showed them to his father in 1983, mostly in jest, but Wilbert was impressed and encouraged him to send them to the publisher. Edmund Ward, by now Kay and Ward, worked fast, getting the book out by September, with Clive Spong as a new illustrator. It was titled Really Useful Engines, but the relation to Wilbert's unwritten book was purely coincidental. October 9th, 1984 would see the premiere of Thomas's show, with it being an instant success and the second season going into production. But by now, Awdry's age was catching up to him. He had begun resigning from his volunteering positions and lost his friend, Teddy Boston, in 1986. 1987 saw the Dean Forest Railway's J.B. Keeling have its name changed to that of its president, Wilbert, who would go on to have his own title in the railway series. The Reverend himself published 2 books this year. A collaboration with P.J. Long became the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway, and his lifelong work with George was released as The Island of Sodor, Its People, History and Railways, his final book. In 1988 he would leave the model exhibition circuit, with the Farquhar branch line's last outing being televised. In July of 1989, Awdry was to speak at a model shop in Gloucestershire, but as he was leaving, Margaret experienced chest pains. Wilbert offered to cancel, but she insisted. The appointment had been made months ago. She was taken to the local hospital, with Awdry making his final goodbye. He was awoken at midnight to the news she had passed away. Without her, the railway series may have never been more than a few bedside stories for Christopher, let alone the cultural phenomenon they became. The following year, Wilbert would attend 2 events celebrating the 45th anniversary of the railway series. One in June at the Ditko Railway Centre, which attracted 25,000 people over 3 days, and another in July at the National Railway Museum, where his books were given a permanent place at the museum. In 1994, Wilbert's brother, George, who had been so important in world building Sodor, passed away. The following year was the 50th anniversary of the Railway series. A documentary, The Thomas the Tank Engine Man, was created by Brian Sibley, along with a biography detailing Wilbert's life. Another celebratory event was held at the National Railway Museum, where an Intercity 225 was given the name Reverend W. Awdry. In 1996, Wilbert was awarded an Order of the British Empire, although his health prevented him from journeying to London to receive it, instead being given it in his Stroud home. On the 21st of March 1997, the Reverend W. Awdry passed away at the age of 85. Wilbert Awdry had started telling stories as a way to entertain his son, but his stories have, and still are, entertaining people around the world. Awdry's legacy has been celebrated in a variety of ways. Many of his belongings, including the Farquhar layout and Sodor relief map, were sent to the Talyllyn for a display and a recreation of his study, and in recent years they have run Awdry extravaganza events. Blue plaques commemorating him were put up at Emneth Vicarage, Ellsworth Rectory and his childhood home, Journey's End, and in 2003 Emneth Church would be given a special stained glass window depicting the author alongside Thomas. The last Railway series book, The Fat Controller's Engines, released in 2011, celebrating the original author's centenary, both in-universe and out. And, for the series' 70th anniversary, he would make an appearance in the television series as the Finn Clergyman, reprising his role in an adaptation of Small Railway Engines. The Reverend Awdry was an influential figure. Although many rail fans wouldn't care to admit it, he has had a lasting impact on the railway community. He was involved heavily in the preservation movement, spread history through lectures and articles, and enjoyed showcasing his model railways. But the Railway series will always be his greatest legacy, and not without reason. He developed an authentic world, weaving history, misadventures and personal experience into engaging tales about the unique personalities of Thomas, Edward, Henry and the other engines of Sodor. Through them he promoted numerous heritage lines, and even 80 years after the first was published, they continue to inspire new generations to fall in love with railways.
Here's the one, here's the